Hi, everybody. It's the waitingfornextyear.com podcast. I'm your host, Craig Lindor, and today we are talking about nets at stadiums in baseball. Yesterday, Francisco Lindor hit a rocket foul ball, hit a 3-year-old in the head. And I know that people getting hit with foul balls and sitting in a baseball stadium at your own risk is as old as baseball itself. But it's really kind of caught hold in the modern culture, and it just seems like the tide has turned, and that as a society we no longer are willing to accept the risk of being impaled by a baseball. Impaled's not the right word, but being hit by a baseball in the stands, and that people are now expecting baseball teams and the stadiums and the team owners to do more and extend the netting down the right and left field lines to protect fans from those rockets off the bats of Major League Baseball players. Not to mention the bats themselves that, once upon a time, Kareem Garcia, when he played for the Brewers, I think, threw his bat into the stands, hit the dude behind me, and I grabbed it. And I actually have a Major League bat from a baseball game. I got to keep it as a souvenir. So, not to even mention the bats that get tossed from time to time. And I understand the struggle. I understand the traditionalists saying, well, we've survived X hundred years without these nets, and why did everything change in 2019? And I understand the perception. I don't agree with it, but I understand the perception that we've become soft and that we no longer tolerate the kind of downside risk associated with sitting there and watching a game. Just like we no longer accept the downside risk of kids under 12 not wearing bike helmets. Certain states have laws about kids wearing bike helmets, and certain states have laws about motorcyclists wearing helmets. I understand things change and people don't like change. It makes sense to me. I understand the traditionalist. I used to be a lot more traditional. I used to fight change for what I felt like change was the sake of change. But more and more, it's just going to happen. And I wanted to give you the insurance guy's perspective on why we need to just stop having the debate and start putting these nets up in stadiums. I volunteer for various groups, and I also sell insurance, and I sell liability policies, and the question that you always ask yourself when you're looking at liability and potential liability of a group putting on an event or running a business is what did you do to mitigate risk? And what did you do to mitigate the potential of a loss? And as long as you can say that you took appropriate steps, people can say that you are not liable. You've covered yourself. If you put padding underneath a rope swing and somebody still falls down and gets hurt, you might find yourself being liable, but you did take some steps. So you at least considered doing something to mitigate the downside risk. Now, traditionally, baseball had limited amounts of nets, and it was assumed that as a fan who bought a ticket, you were sitting there at your own risk, at your own peril. But once the Chicago White Sox extended their nets, and once the second, third, and fourth teams extend their nets, it creates a perception of liability at all the other parks. If we know that placing nets down the lines is a possibility at an American League park like Chicago did, then if somebody were to get nailed with a pitch in Wrigley Field, another Major League Baseball club, now it creates at least the perception of liability on the part of the Cubs because they didn't extend their net. And if we know that you can be safe at a White Sox game in ways that you can't be safe at an Indians game, it creates the perception of liability, and perception of liability becomes reality of liability once it ends up in the courts. And so the fact that there is inconsistent netting in Major League Baseball means that they're going to have to unify their stance on this, and they're going to have to unify what they do. And I think once one team places nets all the way down the lines, I think that from a liability standpoint, from a legal perspective, they all pretty much have to do it. Because while I get that each individual club serves local fans and different fans, I mean, tell me some attorney is not going to take that and extend it to, well, Major League Baseball is a collection of individual business owners, but it's also a single entity. Even though they're different franchises, it's a single entity, and they do set standards and practices for their clubs, and they have failed to set an acceptable standard across all the clubs. And so White Sox fans are in essence safer when they attend a game than Indians fans or Mets fans or whoever else has not extended the netting. And so that's why I think in a lot of ways we're wasting our time with this conversation, because it's going to happen. Once one team does it, I think they kind of all have to do it. It's just a matter of time. And so I know it's going to bother some people, and it's going to feel like an attack on the traditional nature of baseball. But, you know, what is it that we're fighting to protect? Fighting to protect the minimal impact on sightlines and just our basic traditionalism. I don't think that's going to fly ultimately. I think all these ball clubs, all these ballparks are going to have to extend the netting. And I think that's just how it's going to be. That's kind of my perspective as an insurance guy. I just think without it, they're going to create this liability where they previously have denied all liability, and they've gotten away with it for over 100 years or whatever it's been. But I think those days are done. And I know it just feels like the world's gotten softer. Sometimes I feel that way too. But, you know, what's the downside? What's the downside of putting nets up? I think a lot of people are going to be asking themselves that over the next few weeks, and they're going to have a tough time coming up with anything that's the downside. As always, I'm willing to hear your side and hear your opinion. Send it on in. Hit me at on Twitter at WFNYCraig, on the website waitingfornextyear.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back with lots and lots of Browns talk. I've been gearing up. I know we've been taking it slow. It was fun talking to Andy Billman. If you missed that conversation, go back and check it out. It was really good. I really enjoyed it. As always, make sure you check out the Dairy Brothers Tribecast. I've been so happy to have that one on board. And trust me, we're going to gear it up for Brown season, because I've always been kind of a Browns first guy. And this Brown season could be one of the most special Brown seasons of our lifetime, not to mention since 1999. So we'll be here with you. We'll be ready to talk about it. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next time. It's been the waitingfornextyear.com podcast.